Fred Hampton once said that individuals can be jailed or even silenced, but liberation itself can never be imprisoned. That idea is more than a quote. It is the key to understanding why a 21-year-old community organizer became one of the most feared figures in the eyes of powerful institutions in America. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about how real change is born, how it grows, and why it is often met with resistance. Fred Hampton did not rise through wealth, political privilege, or media influence. He rose through discipline, clarity of purpose, and an unshakable belief that ordinary people united could reshape their own future. At an age when most are still searching for direction, Hampton was already organizing food programs, building community clinics, educating young people, and bringing together groups that society had taught to distrust one another. What made him truly dangerous was not anger, but unity. He believed that injustice could not be solved by replacing one form of division with another. Instead, he called for solidarity across race, class, and background, arguing that systems of oppression survive only when people remain divided. His message was simple, but powerful. Lasting change does not come from isolated heroes, it comes from collective action. In today's world, where inequality, misinformation, and social tension still shape daily life, Fred Hampton's words feel uncomfortably relevant. His life forces us to ask difficult questions. Why are voices for unity often treated as threats? What happens when communities begin to organize for themselves? And why do some ideas remain powerful long after the person who spoke them is gone? In this video, we will explore the life, vision, and lasting legacy of Fred Hampton, not as a myth, but as a human being whose ideas continue to echo across generations. If you value stories that challenge official narratives, highlight forgotten voices, and encourage critical thinking, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these important stories alive. As Fred Hampton's influence continued to grow, so did the attention fixed upon him. The same qualities that drew people to his clarity, his discipline, his ability to unite communities that had long been divided also placed him under constant surveillance. By late 1969, the pressure surrounding him had become relentless, creating a tense atmosphere in which every meeting felt watched and every step felt measured. Yet even under this weight, Hampton remained focused on organizing, educating, and building something that extended far beyond himself. Before dawn on December 4, 1969, that tension reached its breaking point. While the city slept, a heavily armed police unit approached an apartment on Chicago's West Side where several members of the Black Panther Party were staying. Inside, Fred Hampton was asleep in his bedroom beside his fiancée, who was nearing the end of her pregnancy. The quiet of the early morning was suddenly shattered as officers forced their way inside and opened fire almost immediately. What followed would later be described by authorities as a justified response to resistance. But the physical evidence told a very different story. Ballistic reports, photographs, and eyewitness accounts revealed that an overwhelming number of shots came from outside the apartment, tearing through walls and doors where people had been sleeping. The layout of the rooms, the angles of the bullets, and the condition of the scene all pointed in one direction. This was not a chaotic exchange between two sides, but a one-sided use of force. Mark Clark was killed almost instantly, struck while near the entrance. Fred Hampton never left his bed. Witnesses inside the apartment later recalled that he barely moved before being struck, his body still and vulnerable as the shooting continued. The narrative of self-defense quickly began to unravel as journalists, lawyers, and community members examined the details more closely. What had been presented as a routine operation increasingly appeared as something far more deliberate. As the story spread, the contrast between official statements and observable facts became impossible to ignore. Doors showed signs of bullets fired inward, not outward. The volume of gunfire suggested intent rather than reaction. Survivors described pleading for the shooting to stop, emphasizing that there were unarmed people inside, including a pregnant woman. These accounts did not align with claims of an aggressive threat from within the apartment. The aftermath only deepened the sense of contradiction. Despite the severity of the raid, No illegal weapons were found that could justify the scale of the response. Investigations later acknowledged serious procedural failures and inconsistencies in police testimony, yet responsibility remained elusive. Official conclusions recognized errors without fully addressing their consequences, leaving families and communities with answers that felt incomplete and unsatisfying. For those who had followed Hampton's work, the events of that morning felt like a grim confirmation of earlier fears. He had often spoken about how movements for unity and justice were met not with dialogue, but with suppression. His death, alongside Mark Clark's, became more than a tragic loss. It became a turning point that exposed how far institutions were willing to go to silence voices they viewed as threatening. Yet even in the face of this violence, the ideas Hampton championed did not disappear. The attempt to erase him instead amplified his message, drawing national attention to the broader struggle he represented. The raid on that apartment was meant to end a chapter, but it opened a deeper conversation about power, truth, and accountability that continues to resonate long after the gunfire faded. In the weeks and months following the raid, many questions lingered unanswered. Official statements tried to close the story quickly, framing the deaths as the tragic outcome of a lawful operation gone wrong. Yet the deeper people looked, the clearer it became that the events of that morning did not begin at the apartment door. They were the final moment of a much longer process, one that had been unfolding quietly, methodically, and largely out of public view. Years later, previously sealed FBI documents began to surface, offering a rare glimpse into that hidden world. These records revealed that Fred Hampton was not merely under observation, but had been identified as part of a broader federal effort known as COINTELPRO. Officially described as a counterintelligence program, it operated in secrecy with the stated goal of protecting national stability. In practice, it focused on monitoring, discrediting, and disrupting political organizations that challenged existing power structures, particularly those advocating systemic change. Within these documents, Hampton's name appeared not because of any criminal act, but because of his ability to inspire unity. Federal officials repeatedly expressed concern over leaders who could bridge racial and economic divisions, fearing that such alliances might reshape political realities. Hampton's work with community programs and his efforts to bring together Black, Latino, and poor white groups placed him squarely within this category. To those reviewing the files decades later, it became clear that what was perceived as a threat was not violence, but cooperation. The program relied on tactics designed to weaken movements from within. Informants were planted, trust was quietly eroded, and misinformation was circulated to provoke suspicion and internal conflict. Meetings were monitored, communications intercepted, knuckle-blinded, and leaders subjected to constant pressure through arrests and public scrutiny. None of this was visible to the communities Hampton served, who saw only the tangible results of his work: children being fed, neighborhoods organizing, and long-standing divisions beginning to soften. As more documents were released, the connection between federal intelligence efforts and local law enforcement actions grew harder to dismiss. The level of detail contained in the files suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Floor plans, schedules, and personal routines were documented with unsettling precision. What appeared on the surface as a sudden and isolated incident now seemed deeply rooted in an organized campaign that viewed Hampton's growing influence as something to be contained at all costs. This revelation reframed the meaning of the raid itself. It was no longer simply a tragic confrontation, but the culmination of months of planning, shaped by a broader strategy. The language used in internal reports was clinical and detached, reducing human lives to variables in an operation designed to neutralize leadership. Such wording revealed a mindset in which social movements were treated as security risks rather than expressions of civic engagement. For many, the release of these documents was both validating and unsettling. They confirmed long-held suspicions within the community, while also exposing the depth of surveillance and control exercised behind closed doors. The idea that a young organizer focused on education and mutual aid could be viewed as a national threat forced a reconsideration of how power responds to grassroots change. Yet even as these files shed light on the machinery behind the scenes, they failed to deliver closure. The documents explained the logic of the program, but not the moral cost. They clarified intentions without fully addressing accountability. What remained undeniable, however, was that the attempt to silence Fred Hampton did not succeed in erasing his impact. Instead, the exposure of COINTELPRO transformed his story into a larger lesson about transparency, dissent, and the fragile line between security and suppression. In revealing the hidden framework surrounding his death, the documents ensured that Hampton's story could no longer be dismissed as an isolated tragedy. It became evidence of a system willing to act in secrecy against ideas it could not control, and a reminder that the struggle for justice often continues long after the official narrative has been written, long before his name became associated with controversy or investigation. Fred Hampton was known in his community for something far more tangible. His leadership within the Black Panther Party was rooted not in slogans or spectacle, but in the everyday realities faced by families who struggled to survive in an unequal system. While outsiders often focused on the Panther's political image, Hampton focused on a simpler question: what do people need right now in order to live with dignity? In the neighborhoods where he organized, poverty was not abstract. Children arrived at school hungry, unable to concentrate. Medical care was often inaccessible, not because illness was rare, but because clinics were distant, expensive, or unwelcoming. Education systems failed to reflect the lives of the students they served, leaving many young people disengaged and uncertain about their future. Hampton understood that political awareness meant little if basic human needs were ignored, and he worked relentlessly to address both at the same time. One of the most visible results of this thinking was the free breakfast program for children. Each morning, volunteers gathered before sunrise to prepare meals, transforming churches and community spaces into places of care and routine. For many children, this was the only guaranteed meal of the day. Parents noticed the change quickly as teachers reported improved focus and attendance. What appeared simple on the surface carried a deeper meaning. It demonstrated that communities could organize effectively and compassionately without waiting for distant institutions to act. Medical clinics followed a similar philosophy. Staffed by volunteer professionals and supported by donations, these clinics offered basic care to those who had long been excluded from the healthcare system. People who had avoided treatment due to cost or fear now had a place where they were treated with respect. Hampton viewed these clinics not as temporary charity, but as a statement of possibility, proof that care could be organized around human need rather than profit. Education initiatives became another pillar of his work. Hampton believed that knowledge was inseparable from empowerment, and he encouraged political education that explained not only history, but the structures shaping daily life. Study groups and community discussions provided space for people to ask questions, share experiences, and develop a sense of collective purpose. This was not education imposed from above, but learning grounded in lived reality, shaped by those it was meant to serve. What made these programs particularly powerful was their inclusivity. They were open to anyone in need, regardless of background, belief, or affiliation. This openness reflected Hampton's broader vision of unity, one that challenged the idea that social change had to follow rigid lines of identity. By meeting people where they were, he built trust across communities that had long been isolated from one another. As participation grew, so did the visibility of these efforts. Local residents saw immediate improvements in daily life, while authorities saw something else entirely. The success of these programs raised uncomfortable questions about why such needs had gone unmet for so long. When community-led solutions proved effective, they exposed the failures of existing systems, and that visibility made Hampton's work increasingly difficult to ignore. Despite mounting pressure, Hampton remained focused on expansion rather than retreat. He spoke openly about the importance of discipline, accountability, and service, insisting that real leadership meant consistency and sacrifice. Those who worked alongside him often recalled his tireless energy and insistence that every program be run with seriousness and respect, because the people relying on them deserved nothing less. In retrospect, these initiatives reveal the true foundation of Hampton's influence. He was not feared because he inspired confrontation, but because he demonstrated an alternative model of power. By improving living conditions through collective effort, He showed that marginalized communities could care for themselves while demanding broader change. His work transformed political ideas into lived experience, ensuring that even after his life was cut short, the example he set continued to challenge assumptions about what justice, leadership, and community truly mean. As Fred Hampton's work expanded beyond individual neighborhoods, his vision grew more ambitious and more unsettling to those in power. He began to recognize a pattern that others either ignored or avoided. Poverty, exclusion, and lack of opportunity did not belong to a single race. They crossed boundaries, languages, and histories, shaping lives in different ways but stemming from similar roots. Hampton believed that any movement serious about change had to confront this reality honestly, even if it challenged long-standing assumptions. In Chicago, a city deeply divided along racial and economic lines, this idea was radical. Communities were often encouraged to see one another as competitors for limited resources, or worse, as enemies. Hampton rejected that framework entirely. He spoke openly about how divisions served those who benefited from inequality, not those who suffered under it. Instead of directing frustration outward, he urged people to look upward at the systems that shaped their shared struggles. This thinking led to what became known as the Rainbow Coalition, an alliance that brought together groups rarely seen standing side by side: Black community organizations, Latino activists, SEMS-AS, and poor white groups from marginalized neighborhoods began to collaborate, not because they shared identical histories, but because they recognized overlapping realities. Meetings that once might have ended in suspicion slowly transformed into spaces of dialogue, cooperation, and mutual support. Hampton's role within this coalition was not that of a distant figurehead. He listened as much as he spoke, emphasizing that unity did not require sameness. Each group brought its own experiences, grievances, and cultural identity, and Hampton insisted that these differences be respected rather than erased. What bound them together was a shared commitment to dignity, fairness, and the belief that no community could be free while others remained trapped in deprivation. Social programs became a practical expression of this unity: food distribution, health initiatives, service and educational efforts were organized collectively, with each group contributing what it could. This cooperation changed perceptions on the ground. People who had once viewed one another through stereotypes now worked side by side, seeing firsthand how similar their concerns truly were. Trust grew not through rhetoric, but through shared responsibility and visible results. For authorities observing from a distance, this development was deeply troubling. A movement that spoke only to one community could be isolated, dismissed, or contained. A movement that connected across racial and class lines was far more difficult to manage. Hampton's ability to articulate a message of solidarity without sacrificing honesty or urgency gave the coalition a sense of momentum that felt unpredictable and uncontrollable. What alarmed officials was not disorder, but organization. Organizations. The coalition challenged the idea that social unrest was inevitable or chaotic by demonstrating discipline and cooperation. It suggested that systemic problems could be addressed collectively, without relying solely on established institutions. In doing so, it exposed how fragile existing power structures could be when people recognized their shared interests. Hampton often emphasized that unity was not about replacing one form of dominance with another. He rejected the notion that progress meant elevating one group at the expense of others. Instead, he framed justice as something expansive, something that grew stronger when more people were included. His language was direct but grounded, focused on material conditions rather than abstract ideology, making his message accessible to people who had never considered themselves political. As the coalition gained visibility, it also attracted intensified scrutiny. Surveillance increased. SEMS-AS meetings were monitored, and efforts were made to sow distrust among participants. Yet the very diversity of the coalition made it resilient. Attempts to isolate one group often strengthened bonds among the others, reinforcing the idea that their struggles were interconnected. In the broader arc of Hampton's story, the Rainbow Coalition represented both his greatest achievement and his greatest perceived threat. It embodied his belief that real change required crossing boundaries that society insisted were fixed. By uniting people across race and class, Hampton challenged not only inequality, but the logic that sustained it. Though his life was cut short, the coalition he helped build remains a powerful example of how solidarity can transform division into collective strength. So here, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire long after the moment has passed. Despite years of investigation, public pressure, and legal action, the final outcome left many questions unanswered. A civil settlement eventually acknowledged that serious violations had occurred, recognizing that rights had been breached and lives irreversibly changed. Yet no official was ever convicted, and no courtroom ruling fully accounted for the loss of Fred Hampton, or the impact of his death on those who believed in his vision. For many, this absence of accountability became as significant as the events themselves, reinforcing the feeling that justice, while spoken of, remained incomplete. And yet, history does not measure legacy solely by verdicts or settlements. Fred Hampton's influence did not end with legal documents or official conclusions. It lived on in the ideas he articulated and the example he set. At just 21 years old, he demonstrated that leadership could be rooted in service, that power could be built through care, and that unity across racial and economic lines was not only possible but necessary. His life challenged the assumption that meaningful change must come from established institutions rather than organized communities. Hampton's story continues to resonate because it speaks to struggles that did not disappear with him. Inequality, division, and mistrust of authority remain part of the modern world, making his message of solidarity feel urgently relevant. He believed that justice was not a gift granted from above, but a responsibility shared by ordinary people willing to stand together. That belief transformed his work from a local effort into a lasting symbol of resistance grounded in humanity rather than hostility. The absence of convictions did not erase the truth uncovered over time. Documents were released, narratives were questioned, and official accounts were re-examined. Each revelation added another layer to the public understanding of what happened, ensuring that the story could not be quietly buried. In this way, Hampton's legacy became a reminder that history is not fixed, and that persistent inquiry can challenge even the most carefully constructed explanations. More importantly, his life offered a model of what solidarity can look like in practice. He did not ask people to abandon their identities, but to recognize their shared interests. He did not promise easy solutions, but he insisted that dignity, education, and care were essential foundations for any just society. These principles continue to inspire movements and conversations far beyond the time and place in which he lived. As we reflect on Fred Hampton's journey, we are left not only with a sense of loss, but with a challenge. His story asks us to consider what unfinished justice means today, and what role each generation plays in shaping a more equitable future. The endurance of his legacy suggests that while individuals may be silenced, ideas rooted in truth and solidarity have a way of surviving. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and engage with a piece of history that still echoes in the present. If you found this exploration meaningful and want to support more in-depth stories like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that these voices, lessons, and histories continue to be shared and remembered.